Excellent. So we left off talking about the birth of opera and this idea that with the age of affect, the idea behind musical rhetoric is that singers can now embody characters and singers can take on roles and play on our emotions in a way that they couldn't do with Renaissance polyphony. So let's talk about the structures they're working in. Let's talk about the background stuff that's all going on behind this new sort of music theory. Well, first of all, in the Baroque era, so like starting around 1600, we're starting to see the idea of a social contract in society. Question? Okay, maybe just a mic slip. Okay. So this, chat. Oh, that's okay. No problem, Will. Good. So this idea of a social contract among the different members of society. Remember back in the Middle Ages, we talked about the three estates and you have your place in society and most people's places weren't good. So yeah, but in the Baroque era, we start to see a rejection of feudalism as feudalism, because feudalism is kind of just a fancy word for slavery. And in the Baroque era, people are starting to recognize the dignity of humans, right? This is the era of humanism. So learned men began to consider their responsibility to those they rule over. In other words, if you are at the top of that feudal hierarchy, if you are an aristocrat or a royal, a monarch, then you have a responsibility to care for your people, not just take from and exploit them. We start seeing that idea emerge in the Baroque era. People are starting to ask questions like, what motivates human power? Who deserves power? What is the purpose of government and institutions? And by the end of the Baroque era, we actually start to see the origins of modern democratic thought. It's no accident that the American Revolution occurred right after the Baroque era. That's no accident, because in the Baroque era, this idea of every human should have a voice in whatever laws govern them is emerging. And the most lavish artistic projects in the Baroque era were serving to prop up the aristocracy and the monarchy in ways that rulers were trying to demonstrate their purpose. Rulers were trying to demonstrate, I don't just have power, but I use it wisely. I use it for the good of my people. Can we see how those ideas are interrelated and how they would motivate the creation of art? Excellent. So with this new kind of patronage, we see a rise of the artisan and merchant middle class. So people could earn money through their skills. Now you didn't just have to inherit it. You could actually come into a little cash through your own abilities. There's also this idea that these artisans and merchants who are earning money, they now have expendable capital. So the Baroque era is actually when we start to see the ideas of the theory of capitalism forming, because this idea that everybody has some expendable amount of money and can use it to prop up what we call the free market. That's emerging in the Baroque era, and artists are engaging in that. People with expendable capital, so like this new middle class artisans and merchants, were not only creating art themselves, they felt that they had a duty to support and participate in the arts, even without being noble or at court. And this contributes to the formation of those academies that we talked about, those groups of learned individuals whose sole purpose is to sit around discussing art, literature, philosophy. The noblest goal of man was to think. That's all. That's what humanism is. So all of these ideas are intertwined. Does this make sense to everybody? Because these are some heady concepts. Awesome. Now, in addition to these shifting political theories and structures, we've, of course, got good old-fashioned conflict. So we see this thing called the 30 Years' War emerge. Now, remember back when we talked about the 100 Years' War, and I said, don't let that trivia question fool you, that it actually wasn't 100 years even. The 30 Years' War won't fool you. It was exactly 30. Oh, question? Michaela, was that you? Question? Okay, maybe a mic blip. That's cool. So the 30 Years' War was exactly 30 years even. So it was ostensibly a religious conflict between, oh, question, David? Microphone, yep, okay. David, same thing, or was that a question from you?
No, I just joined late, my bad.
Okay. Good, so ostensibly religious. In other words, people are saying that it's about religion between Catholics and Protestants. And on a certain level it was, but it was mostly political. Now, there were three religious factions. It wasn't just Catholics, Protestants. We had some Protestants fighting each other. So there was, of course, the Catholic Church, then the Lutheran adherents, and the Calvinist adherents. A few weeks ago, when we talked about the Reformation, we talked about the difference between Lutherans and Calvinists. So I'm going to assume you all still have that in your head, or do we need a refresher? Can I get hands up if we need a refresher on Luther versus Calvin? Okay, good. I see thumbs. I don't see hands, so I think we're good. Good. Okay, so these three groups are actually fighting each other. Now, the main conflict, like I said, is political. What we've got is imperialists. And when I say imperialists, I mean the Holy Roman Empire ruled by the Habsburg family, like the one Mozart served a couple hundred years later. That's here. So that same Habsburg family is on one side ruling the empire. And then we've got anti-imperialists. Those are confederations of smaller German principalities that relied on Protestant countries to help them fight the Catholic Habsburgs, because the Habsburgs are being propped up by the Pope. They're a Catholic family, and the Holy Roman Empire is a Catholic empire. And these rebels are being, not rebels, that makes them sound, well, the point being, Protestants are coming into Germany to try and overturn the Habsburg family. So the Holy Roman Emperor, who also happens to be the King of Belgium, BT dubs, this is very complicated, he tries to make everyone follow the Catholic Church, and the Lutheran nobles, so like the electors, the margraves, the burgraves, the landgraves, all of those German aristocrats rebelled because they didn't want to follow the same religion as their emperor. Now, even though this is a centrally German conflict, because of all those sticky alliances between members of the same religious denominations, it actually involved most of Europe. So, of course, Germany and Austria, but also Sweden, Denmark, Poland, parts of Russia, Spain, the Netherlands, and the Baltic states. That's most of Europe. And they're all contributing troops, and they're all contributing resources, and they're all dying in this 30 Years' War. Now, the 30 Years' War is devastating to the continent of Europe because, well, first of all, it's taking place in their backyards, but also it's fought by mercenaries. Anybody know what a mercenary is?
Soldier for hire.
Precisely. So they're not fighting for their own country. They have been paid to fight a war for somebody else. That means part of their pay is the plunder they take. And these mercenaries were getting paid by looting any of the villages that they came through. So all of Europe was being plundered by Europe. And it left everybody destitute for a good part of the 17th century. So that's another part of society that underlies, especially the work of Schutz that we're going to talk about today, but pretty much all of Europe in the 17th century. Now, despite us talking about Schutz a lot today, we have to recognize the Italian influence that was governing pretty much all of European vocal music in the Baroque era. So flashback to a couple hundred years ago when the St. Mark's School became a thing in Venice, and the choir school at the Basilica started to dominate European polyphony. Remember that in the Middle Ages, it was the Franco-Flemish composers, and then the St. Mark's School, the Venetian school, started being the cutting edge proprietors, if you will, of all of good polyphony. And that's thanks to their wealth of resources like the double choir loft and all of those instrumentalists they could afford. But that influence of St. Mark's has only grown in the years since. So by the Baroque era, they are the pinnacle of European compositional technique. And we can look at a couple of specific composers who were responsible for that in the Baroque era. First was Giovanni Gabrieli. Remember, we heard one of his motetti concertati, that In Ecclesiis. We heard him already. He was an organist and composer who trained with his uncle Andrea. He pioneered that motetti concertati genre. And most importantly to us today, he had lots of German and Austrian students and patrons like Hans Leo Hosler, the Fugger family, and Heinrich Schutz. The other composer at St. Mark's we can point to is Claudio Monteverdi. Remember that we talked about St. Mark's history being divided into musical eras. Monteverdi is said to initiate the fourth musical era. So if Adrian Villart initiated the third musical era, where we see that proliferation of counterpoint, Monteverdi initiates the fourth musical era, when we start to see monody and when we start to see these dramatic works coming up out of Venice. Now, both of these fellows, Gabrieli and Monteverdi, taught Heinrich Schutz. He went to Italy for several years on two separate occasions, purely to study with those two composers. So Schutz was born in Saxony. This is not Germany as we know it yet. But remember, Germany is still a bunch of disjunct principalities. So Schutz was born in the Principality of Saxony. He got some local notice by the Margrave, the ruler of Saxony. And the Margrave actually convinced him and paid him to quit law school, as so many composers in history. He was studying to be a lawyer and then got noticed for his talent. And the Margrave sent him to Venice to study with Gabrieli. Then what happens is Schutz is such a good student that he keeps getting poached by higher and higher nobles. And when you're an aristocrat, you don't get to say no to the aristocrat above you. So if you're on like tier 1 of the aristocracy and somebody on tier 2 comes and says, hey, this really talented musician, I like him, he's going to come work for me now. Musician or aristocrat on tier 1 doesn't get to say no, he's staying here. So Schutz keeps getting poached really by higher and higher people on the hierarchy. So he works his way up, goes about as far as he can in Germany, and he gets sent back to Venice to study with Monteverdi. It's kind of like, you know how when you get out in the real world and you have to take those continuing education credits? That's kind of what Schutz was doing. And he's keeping his training up to date in the latest musical practices, the latest compositional techniques coming out of St. Mark's. So he gets sent back to Venice to study with Monteverdi. Eventually, Schutz became the court composer of the Elector of Dresden. Now, an elector is the highest type of aristocrat in those German principalities. They are the ones responsible for, in theory, electing the emperor. So like those Habsburgs who ruled over the entire empire, the electors would be responsible for electing an emperor. Now, what Schutz does for these German territories when he comes back to Dresden is he introduces Italian monody into German choral music. And Schutz is known above all for his dramatic ability. He wrote the first opera in Germany. He wrote the first German opera. That's a historic achievement, and even a set of passions. So he's, coming a solid century before Bach, and yet he's achieving those same landmarks. Now, a huge example where we see his dramatic ability and the influence of his Italian studies is in his books of Symphoniae Sacrae. As you can tell, what do you guys think, without using Google Translate for this one? What does Symphoniae Sacrae mean?
Sacred symphony.
Exactly. These are polyphony. This is religious polyphony, is what it is. And Symphoniae Sacrae is what Heinrich Schutz calls motetti concertati. Somebody remind me what motetti concertati is. We said Gabrieli did them at St. Mark's. What are motetti concertati? You guys aren't sick of my voice yet?
Sorry. Isn't it when it's like a motet but with like multiple voices and multiple instruments along with an organ?
Exactly. It's a motet that's concerted, arranged. When Gabrieli put those instruments with it, that was its own historic achievement. Because remember, before then, we said that composers did not specify what instruments should play which part. Gabrieli was one of the first to do that. That is a motetto concertato, a concerted motet, arranged motet. So somebody else repeat back to me, please. So Mark, you got it 100%. I want to make sure this whole group feels totally comfortable. Somebody new, repeat back to me or explain back to me in your own words, I should say, what a motetto concertato is. I'm gonna start playing my Pink Floyd. Is anybody out there?
Isn't it like a motet, except each line is given a specific instrument that's supposed to play it?
Yes, that's what it is. Good. Okay. Thank you, Mark and Nick. Two people feel really comfortable with this concept. Excellent. So Schutz's Symphoniae Sacrae are motetti concertati. The way we see this play out in Schutz's music is very similar to the way we see it play out in Gabrieli's. Schutz writes Zal. He writes this particular Symphonia Sacra for 6 vocal soloists, 2 4-part choirs, 2 violins, and basso continuo. So he's got 6 individual people who are doing their own independent things. He's got 2 SATB choruses that are acting as groups. He's got 2 separate groups, 2 violins, and basso continuo. Somebody remind me what basso continuo is.
It's like the instrument or voice that like does like the bass line that determines like the figured bass. And
Exactly. Figured bass is exactly it. So it's a bass line with those intervals above it, and they have to fill in the harmonies based on whatever numbers, based on whatever intervals are written above the bass note. So this basso continuo is played by a violone and an organ. Now, a violone is, as you can tell from the name, a big old violin. It is, I don't even want to call it comparable to a modern cello because they sound very, 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 very different, and their courses are very, very different. But it's let's just say it's similar to a modern cello. A violone is a big violin that sits on the ground. You play it like you would play a cello, kind of. And that's taking care of part of the basso continuo. The other part is organ. So the way they do it is that the violone is going to hold and sustain notes, while the organ is filling in the harmonies above it. So like the violone is sustaining a bass note while the organ puts all the flourishes in. Does everyone feel good about the division of labor in this basso continuo? Can I get thumbs or hands? Okay. Good, good. I see a bunch of thumbs and I don't see any. Okay, so that's what's going on instrumentally in Zal Zal. Now, the entire text of this symphonia is basically two, well, not basically, it is 2 sentences. Zal, Zal, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the goad. Is anybody familiar with that text or where it comes from? If you're not, that's okay, I'll explain. I just, you know.
This is just a random guess, but is it the Bible? Because it says Saul.
This is the conversion story of, in the Christian tradition, Saint Paul. So for anyone not familiar with the story, Saint Paul is riding along on his horse, and he's going to persecute the early Christians. He's going to take them back to be killed. And while he's on his horse, he gets struck down, he gets blinded, and he hears this booming voice from heaven saying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It will be hard for thee to kick against the goad. So this is God speaking to Saul in Schutz's setting. And the way Schutz does this, the way Schutz makes it so effective, here's where his dramatic ability comes in, is he has this Zal, Zal, the name, echoing, resounding over and over and over again. It's like rattling around in your head. It's beating you down. And he does this not only through repeating Zal, Zal, like you're going to hear, well, you already have heard, in theory, you should have already listened to this. So when you listen to this, you hear this repeated name coming at you and beating you down, but every time it comes in, it gets louder. So it overwhelms you, it takes you over, step by step, but very rapidly. With each repetition, so with each echo, we see it rising through the tessitura. We hear the voices starting out with this very low, grumbly bass. And as it grows, Schutz gives that Zal, Zal to higher and higher voices. So it's, again, kind of like it's overtaking you, as well as being, you know, the voice of God echoing around. What makes it even more disorienting is the fact that Schutz, he's using a regular meter here, but he's not setting the words on accented beats. He's setting the words on unaccented beats and irregularly. So it's not even as if it were a point of imitation where we have regular repetitions of a motive. He's setting zao, zao, zao at irregular intervals. What makes it even more disorienting than that is that Schutz puts in rests in really odd places. So he's not going to give you words on accented beats. He's going to give you rests on accented beats. And he's going to put rests in between words where you don't expect them. And the final thing that Schutz does to make this dramatic is this use of Hocket. We've mentioned Hocket in here before. Does anybody remember what Hocket is?
I don't. I really need a refresher on that word.
I can do that. So Hocket literally means hiccup. What Hocket is when the composer gives the same motive, not as a point of imitation. I'm sorry, he divides the line up among the voices. So it's not that each voice is repeating what the other voices have done. It's that each voice chimes in at a different part. So imagine row, row, row your boat, where every person in the group just sings one word at a time. So person A sings row, person B sings the next row, person C sings row, person D sings your, and person E sings boat. So basically the melodic line is divvied up among all of the voices. And that's why it's called a hiccup, because you're bouncing around. One person chimes in for one note, the next person chimes in for another note, and so on and so forth. Does everyone feel good about what Hocket is? Can I get thumbs or hands on this?
I understand. I just had a side question, just for curiosity. The reason why that was made, like, I mean, why? I mean, that, like, I get it. The only thing that I can see coming from that is, I mean, you're able to feature people, but at the same time, you started with row, row, row your boat. I'm like, that just seems kind of redundant.
Why? Well, it all comes back to the text, right? This is a form of text painting. So sometimes it could be used for humorous effect. If I have a humorous song and I want to make the joke sound like the joke is that the line sounds very disjointed, then I can use it for humorous effect in that joke. In this case, why am I doing it? Because I want it, well, Schutz wants it. I am no Schutz. Schutz wants it to sound disorienting. So Hocket is just a compositional technique that can be used whenever the text might call for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Oh, in the chat. I think it has something to do with physical space. Yeah, exactly, Mark. That's why this is so very disorienting. It's the same thing that happens, like, if anybody here listens to like psychedelic rock, if you're listening to like Led Zeppelin or something, they do this with their recording techniques in the studio. What they do is they pan the instruments and the voices for that matter. They pan the parts to come from different spaces. So it disorients you. It's just a way of playing with your perception of the real world. Because obviously Schutz did not have, you know, the same studio equipment that Led Zeppelin has. So this is his way of doing that. And as Mark said, it really does have a lot to do with your perception of space. Everyone feel good with that? Thumbs or hands? Okay, good. No, John, don't change that heart. You should be a Hocket fan. Okay, good. So, yes. Oh, and also madrigalisms. Somebody, now I know you guys know this because we've hammered it home. Somebody who hasn't spoken yet, I want to hear a new voice. Tell me what madrigalisms are.
It's like the devices or like characteristics that you would find in a madrigal.
Precisely. What kind of characteristic? Like what do we see in a madrigal that makes it madrigalism?
Like text painting?
Yes, yes, exactly. Madrigalisms are very specific kinds of text painting. Changing the textures, tone. Yeah, Perla, that could be one way of painting the text. And Andres, volume can be another way of painting the text. So for instance, if I'm in a madrigal and I talk about hard to think of a specific example, but if the text mentions something about say a different person talking, then I could change the texture to reflect that different person talking. Yeah, Andres, if I'm talking about something loud, then I'm going to make the text, or I'm going to make my singing loud. Yeah, textures and volume are can be a kind of text painting. They're not the only kinds, but they can be a kind of text painting. Do we all feel good with madrigalisms? Thumbs or hands on this, because this is really important. We really need to understand madrigalisms. Okay, I don't see any hands. So good, good. Okay, I'm seeing thumbs, good. So that is all the stuff Schutz does to make this symphonia dramatic, to make the story come alive, to make us feel like we're in the story. So let's listen to Zal Zal. And my question for you, you guys have the text in front of you. You should have your Norton Anthologies out. You have the text. What madrigalisms is he using to make this so effective? Okay, here we go. Here's Zal Zal.
Saul, 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 was verfolgst du mich? Saul, 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 was verfolgst du mich? Saul, 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 was verfolgst du mich? Saul, 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 was verfolgst du mich? Was verfolgst du mich? Was verfolgst du mich? Es wird dir schwer werden, wie eine Stachel zu lösen. Es wird dir schwer werden, wie den Stachel zu lösen. Saul, 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 was verfolgst du mich? Was verfolgst du mich? Was verfolgst du mich? Es wird dir schwer werden, wieder den Stachel zu lösen. Es wird dir schwer, es wird dir schwer, es wird dir schwer, es wird dir schwer, es wird dir schwer werden, es wird dir schwer, wieder den Stachel.
Okay. So we've got through a couple of the Zal Zal sections. You hear them asking questions. What madrigalisms do you hear? How is this dramatic to you?
What was the one that started with an H? That's like the repeating, like that we just talked about.
Oh, Hocket?
Yeah, sorry, I was like blanking. like that.
Yeah,
The biggest one, I guess.
good, yeah. So I think that was around 24 seconds. This that's no fun. Okay, so we all heard the Hocket there.
Yeah.
Good, good. And that is very disorienting because it's not even like Schutz is going in order from lowest to highest or highest to lowest. It's bouncing around the different registers. Good. What else makes this dramatic to y'all?
I think the mixture of texture in the piece. So like there's some people that are like it's very chatty and like quick, and they're like saying the phrase, the titular phrase over and over quickly, and then some voices are like saying it really slowly, or like, you know, holding out notes. So it's like it's kind of like he's hearing it not only a million times but a million different ways, like a million voices in his head like telling him the same thing.
That's a great point. Yeah. And this goes along with that idea that Schutz plays with accented and unaccented beats. So it's not as if he's just letting this ring naturally through the German tongue. It's split up different ways each time. He's using different rhythms. He's going at different speeds. Yeah, excellent point.
There are
I want to,
some resolutions that are like that end in a major chord that when previously, like before, it sounded like it was going to resolve into a minor chord.
mm-hmm.
And
So
that was like confusing.
Picardy thirds abound here. Schutz wouldn't have called them Picardy thirds, but
I
that's
was gonna say that, but I wasn't sure if that would have been right to call it that. I just didn't know. But yeah, that's the texture that I felt was like. It sounds like a Picardy third to make it more like surprising or confusing.
yeah, totally. Because we're expecting a minor resolution, and all of a sudden it gets this really bright sound. Now just a little bit of clarification on vocab, y'all. When we say texture in music, what we're really talking about is the number and type of voices, and by voices I mean instruments as well, like so the number of performing forces that are engaged at any given time. So texture would be something like which instruments are playing when, and then like harmony would be something like a Picardy third, or rhythm would be something like that changing way of setting was befolkst du mich. So yeah, just
That's sort of what I meant by texture. Like there's people singing this different ways but at the same time, like there's like, okay, so for example, like the Sopranos had like a really high note and it's like super drawn out, while like other voices are still being very chatty and like fast like underneath that. So like,
okay.
you know what I mean? Like, so if you were gonna say quote unquote that they were different instruments or whatever, different like, you know, like what is each instrument or voice doing at any given time? It's very confusing because it's like so starkly contrasted between, like, for example, the bass or the soprano, you know, doing completely separate things.
Yes, good. That's precisely. And the other fun thing about the texture in this piece is how often Schutz changes it. So he goes from emphasizing the voices to emphasizing the instruments, emphasizing the soloists to emphasizing the choirs, emphasizing one soloist versus emphasizing, you know, all of the soloists together. Nice. Okay, so that, yeah, perfect. That is texture. Anybody else noticing anything dramatic about Schutz's writing here? Okay, let's go ahead. So that's Schutz's Symphonia Sacra for you. Now, an important innovation in the Baroque era that makes a lot of instrumental music possible, and specifically above all keyboard music possible, is equal temperament. Now, equal temperament is a tuning system, and it is one of many tuning systems that have existed throughout the centuries of music. I mean, millennia of music, really. So there were other tuning systems that preceded it and can still be used. Of course, there was just intonation. That was a medieval tuning system that was prevalent in the Middle Ages. And what just intonation does, it's based on those Pythagorean intervals and ratios that we talked about, like the octave making a perfect 2-to-1 ratio, fifths having a 3-to-2 ratio, fourths having a 4-to-3, seconds 9-to-8. So the way that just intonation works is that you are tuning each interval to those ratios. I want to make sure that A3 is in an exact 2-to-1 proportion to A4. I want to make sure that A3 is in an exact 9-to-8 relationship to B3. So that precise Pythagorean interval has to be hit. Now, the problem with this is it results in what we call the comma. I'm not going to get into the comma because it's a lot of numbers, and we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about, you know, the sense of difference. So I'm not going to get into the precise numbers behind the comma, but just know that the comma is the remainder at the end of an octave once we've tuned the earlier notes in an octave to these Pythagorean ratios. The more octaves we try to stack on each other, the bigger the comma gets. So these ratios are really cool when I'm dealing with like maybe a range of 1 octave. But if I have a keyboard that's several octaves big, or heaven forbid, an organ with manuals upon manuals of octaves to deal with, then I'm in trouble. So we can see that just intonation is not going to suit us very well as we add more and more and more voices in the Baroque era. Another type of tuning system was mean tone tuning, and that emerged by about 1500. In mean tone tuning, the focus is on making the thirds in perfect tune. So perfect fifths were tuned by slightly flattening the fifth, because your whole goal was to stack perfectly tuned thirds. Now, to do that, to stack thirds, I have to keep ever so slightly lowering my fifth. So the third would be it results just in a compression. So only a few keys could sound good. So just intonation might sound good for 1 octave. Mean tone tuning, because it adjusts the fifth to accommodate the third, that'll only sound good in a few keys at once. So if I tune my keyboard using mean tone tuning in the key of C, I can play pieces in the key of C and they'd sound okay. I might be able to get away with a piece in F or G, but if I try to stray too far from that, it's going to sound really out of tune really fast. If I tune my keyboard using mean tone tuning in C major and I try to play something in B flat, oh, heaven help my ears. So these earlier tuning systems have their limitations. Now, to be fair, so does equal temperament, but it's a huge advancement in that it allows us to play in all keys in relatively decent tune. Instead of deciding to sacrifice some keys for the sake of other keys, it's kind of like you make all the keys imperceptibly out of tune. So you're spreading out the sacrifice among all your keys. What happens with equal temperament is that instead of the third being the guiding interval, the fifth is the guiding interval. So the root and fifth of all 12 keys are tuned perfectly. I have to get all of the fifths in order. Then the third of each key is adjusted or tempered to be halfway between the root and the fifth. So the third is equidistant. Now we're not stacking thirds and compressing fifths. We're tuning the fifth and stretching the third. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, can I get thumbs or hands? Hands if you don't feel good on what equal temperament is. Okay, good. I see a lot of thumbs, so that helps. So we call this equal temperament because all 12 semitones are then equally distributed throughout the octave. And like I said, this allows all 12 keys to be used without having to retune your instrument. It also allows the cycle of fifth progressions and emphasis on this 5-1 relationship. So as I said, when we entered the Baroque period around 1600, we start to see functional harmony. I can now label things as chords. I can now label tonic, dominant, subdominant. I can assign functions to roots of triads. And equal temperament tuning allows me to explore tonic, dominant, tonic, dominant, tonic, dominant throughout all of those keys. So this is a hugely significant advancement in music technology, really. So equal temperament is undergirding all of this instrumental stuff that we're hearing. Equal temperament makes all of this instrumental exploration possible. Now, in addition to the instrumental stuff, we've also got plenty of vocal stuff going on. So we talked about the birth of opera. We talked about the Florentine Camerata. We talked about monody. We talked about the prima pratica and seconda pratica. Let's talk about its cousin genre, the oratorio. The problem with opera is that theaters and concert halls were closed during what the Christians would call the penitential seasons, that is Advent and Lent. Those are times of the year when Christians live austerely. They are supposed to sacrifice things. They are supposed to turn away from earthly pleasure. So in those seasons of sacrifice, theaters and concert halls were closed. You're not supposed to be going out for fun and entertainment. You're supposed to be repenting. So oratorios became a workaround for this. Oratorios are sung dramas, just like operas, but on religious topics. Now there's a precedent for this. Remember the liturgical dramas stretching all the way back to the time of Hildegard von Bingen. Remember spiritual madrigals we talked about that were madrigals on devotional topics, the concerted motets, like at St. Mark. And there were also these like types of monodies on religious subjects called laudae or praises. It literally means praises. So there would even be a more contemporary genre called laudae, which gives precedent to these oratorios. Now, this is all a part of a push, these art forms that dramatize devotion. These oratorios are part of a push to dramatize the religious and spiritual encounter of the divine. Remember, in the Baroque era, they are countering the Protestant Reformation. All of this dramatic religious art is a way of trying to convince believers that you as a Catholic can have that personal relationship with God. You as a Catholic can have mystical experiences of the divine. So this comes out of that Catholic Counter-Reformation art movement. The name oratorio comes from the word oratory. And it's an oratory is a meeting room of religious orders. So like if you have a group of monks or nuns, each of their abbeys, monasteries, convents, wherever they live, each of their dwelling places will have an oratory where the whole group meets to discuss things. And specifically, there was a congregation led by a guy named Filippo Neri. And he had what he called the Congregazione dell'Oratorio, the congregation of the meeting room. His whole chapter's purpose was kind of like an academia or an academy for theology. So just like the Florentine Camerata would sit around discussing art, Filippo Neri's congregation of the oratory would sit around discussing theology. And for them, music was an edifying entertainment meant to purify souls. By listening to this music, you were supposed to become a better person. Boy, that sounds like the age of affect, doesn't it? So this oratorio genre grew up specifically out of the Congregazione dell'Oratorio, where they would use music to purify listeners. And oratorios used the exact same musical style as operas. You've still got recitative, you've still got arias, you've still got those canzonettas. The only difference is oratorios are unstaged, uncostumed, and they deal in purely religious texts. There is no ancient Greek or Roman mythology here. There are no gods and heroes. There are no ancient kings. This is taken straight from the Christian Bible. Specifically, most oratorios came from the Old Testament. So they weren't even dramatizing the Gospels. They were dramatizing the events of the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures. So that's a new way of dramatizing religious matter for listeners. The one musical thing that differentiates oratorio from opera is that oratorios placed much more of an emphasis on the chorus over the soloists. So of course you would have soloists in the oratorio because they would have to play parts, right? I need somebody playing the part of King David. I need somebody playing the part of Saul. I need somebody playing the part of Jephthah. But they are kind of not the important ones. The chorus is the biggest part of the oratorio. Why? Because they have to narrate. They have to do all of the, since it's not staged, you need a chorus to explain what's going on and setting each scene and advancing action. So soloists are kind of a small part of the oratorio. The emphasis is really on the chorus. Does everyone feel good with what an oratorio is? A few more thumbs. Let's get a few more thumbs before I go. We all feel good about what an oratorio is? Okay, good. I'm seeing a lot of thumbs now. Excellent. So another vocal genre that emerges at this time is the cantata. And this is a specifically aristocratic genre. Much like the madrigal before it, this is something that only the learned people at court are going to do. This is something for people who have a lot of time on their hands and a lot of expendable cash to sit around commissioning and performing and playing and singing. So the cantata is an aristocratic art form. The word cantata is literally Italian for sung. So it's any piece of music that is for voices and instruments together. Now, these cantatas are generally secular, so they're not the same thing as motetti concertati or symphonia sacra. These cantatas are specifically for voices and instruments in a secular courtly setting. And I've given you a nice little extended quote here from a scholar named N. Lee Orr, and he is one of the foremost people writing about oratorios. So I am just giving you his definition. And can somebody who's not me do the honors?
Yeah, sure, I'll do it.
Rock, thank you.
The cantata is a vocal form consisting of solos, ensembles, and choruses accompanied by orchestra, piano, or other combinations of instruments. The cantata may have sacred or secular texts and can be narrative or dramatic. Defining the cantata in contrast to its relative, the oratorio, is difficult. The most reliable distinctions between the two genres are length and subject. Typically, oratorios tend to be religious, dramatic, and long-lasting for 1 or more hours, while cantatas are generally shorter and feature secular themes. Most cantatas are written for mixed chorus, some are for male chorus, and even fewer are for female chorus.
Thank you. That was a beautiful performance in and of itself. So there's your definition of cantata. Similar to an oratorio, but shorter and secular. So let's look at where cantatas came from. Originally, these are strophic monodies, where the melody for each strophe varied. Somebody remind me what strophic means. This is something we have hit several times, so we should all know what strophic is.
It's in stanzas, right? Like poetry?
Yes, good. It's in stanzas, verses. That is strophic. So a cantata is something in, oh, did I freeze? Are we good?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay, thank you. I saw myself freeze for a second. I wanted to make sure that we were all still together. Okay. So a cantata is something that is in those stanzas, those verses, those strophes. That's our basic form, strophic. And the melody for each strophe was a little bit different. Like you could still follow the melody, but it was almost like a theme and variation kind of thing, where the first strophe gives us the melody straight, and then each verse after that has its own little change, has its own little inventions. So we can follow the basic blocks, but each time it gives us these little surprises that keep the interest going. As we talked about, these cantatas are usually on secular subjects, and they're much shorter in length. But like oratorio and like opera, they alternate recit and aria. So somebody remind me what recit is and what aria is. That's something we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks. What is recit or recitative?
It's like when it's not, it's similar to speaking, like speaking but singing, sort of, as opposed to aria, which is like the song that like the people on the stage, like the characters, like recognize it as singing. But recitative is more like dialogue.
Absolutely. So that recitative is like the heightened poetry, the heightened recitation. That's where we get recitative. It's that heightened recitation of poetry that the Camerata came up with and Monteverdi flourished with. So it's unmetered, it's unrhymed, it doesn't have a regular poetic meter. So even the linguistic meter doesn't follow any type of pattern. Yeah, it's conversation. And then the aria is the song-like part. It's rhymed, it has a regular meter. We've got the whole orchestra accompanying us, and so on and so forth. So we're alternating those sections of recit and aria in these cantatas, much like we did with opera and oratorio. Now, originally, these arias had no set form. The cantata just means it's a piece, closer to a motet or a madrigal in length, arranged for voice and instrumental ensemble. But eventually, what we see by the later Baroque era is the advent of da capo arias. Now, I'm going to talk more about da capo arias in the next couple weeks as we advance through the Baroque era. So I won't belabor the point now, but I want you to have that term in your head already. I want you to see da capo aria and think, oh, Baroque aria. Okay, da capo, Baroque, da capo, Baroque. Good, we're associating those two things in our head. Okay. Now, these cantatas could be da camera or da chiesa, but they were always in the vernacular language as opposed to Latin. Vernacular meaning the language that we all speak in here and now, like it would be in Italian rather than Latin, or it could be in German rather than Latin. So they were always in the vernacular language of the composer. The distinction between da camera and da chiesa literally means chamber, camera, or church, chiesa. So I could have a da camera cantata, which would be a chamber cantata sung in a chamber of a nobleman's house. Or I could have a cantata da chiesa, a church cantata, which would be on a religious subject, but again, much shorter than an oratorio. Now, originally, these things were Italian, as you can tell from the name cantata, but eventually they spread to France and Germany, and Lutheran culture was all for using secular music in worship. Remember Luther's Contrafacta, those pop songs that he would just write a new text to and bring them into the Lutheran worship services. So Lutherans loved this idea. And Lutherans, the cantata genre flourished in Lutheran culture. Cantata didn't have the same aristocratic associations in Germany as it did in Italy. And if we look ahead to the end of the Baroque era, we see J.S. Bach advancing the art of the chorale cantata. We'll talk about him more when we actually get to the end of the Baroque, but again, I want you to have chorale cantata in your head as a subgenre of cantata. So overarching genre, cantata, chorale cantata, Lutheran subgenre. We good? Cantata, Italian, Lutheran cantata, German subgenre. Thumbs or hands on that? Good. Okay, good, okay, good. I'm starting to see more, good. So that brings us to the last piece that I asked you guys to listen to for today. And we previewed this piece last time. We previewed that piece by Barbara Strozzi, Lagrime Mie. Now, Strozzi was a Venetian singer, and she frequently, not just in this case, but she frequently composed music for herself to write. So she's kind of like the Carole King of her day, where she's the singer-songwriter singing her heart out to you. And she built this whole reputation in the courts of Venice as a heightened noblewoman with a lot of talent. So Barbara Strozzi is building this cult of personality. This is all, Lagrime Mie is part of that. And Lagrime Mie is a secular cantata. What it is a lament for a beloved. So she did not write the poetry, that she's taking pre-existing poetry and setting it to music. And the poet is lamenting his love. She's locked away in a tower, he can't reach her. No, I am so sad. How will I ever attain you? So this whole cantata is a lament. Now, the first line of Lagrime Mie, which is, of course, Lagrime Mie, becomes kind of a refrain. And we hear that keep approaching us or reapproaching us in between the different strophes. So that musical idea of lagrime mie keeps coming back. It's like a refrain. What makes this a lament is the descending tetrachord. Now, does anybody know what a descending tetrachord is? Because this is something that we still use even today to express sadness.
Is it like do, ti, la, so?
Exactly. It's those 4 scalar notes descending right down the scale. And it can start on do. It can also start on so sometimes if you feel adventurous. But it usually is do, ti, la, sol. Or if you're in the major, do, te, la, sol. So that descending tetrachord, those 4 scalar notes that just go right down the scale, is kind of a universal symbol for sadness in music. If you hear those 4 descending notes, especially in a bass line at any time, you know the composer is trying to convey sadness. And that's exactly what Strozzi does here. She makes this whole thing a lament by using the descending tetrachord. Now, we have recit sections and we have aria sections, of course. And the recit sections are in versi sciolti, free verse. There's no iambic pentameter. There's no dactyls. There's no trochees. None of that. It's versi sciolti. There's no regular meter. But what those versi sciolti lines do have in common is that they are what we call endecasyllabi, lines of 11 syllables. So endecasyllabi, 11 syllables. Someone shout it out for me. What is a line of endecasyllabi?
11 syllables.
Yes. It seems silly, but I really need you guys to get that. Good. So all of the recit lines have 11 syllables, even though they're in free verse. But we get a little more structured in the aria section. There are 2 quatrains of aria. Somebody remind me what a quatrain is.
It's a stanza that has 4 lines.
Yes, good. Quattro, 4, quatrain, 4-line stanza, syllable, strophe, verse, whatever you want to call it. It is a group of 4 lines. So unstructured, structured, recit, aria, 11 syllables, 2 quatrains. Does everyone feel good about this before we take a listen? Oh, okay, good. Now I'm seeing a bunch of thumbs. My question for you on this one is actually the same as it was with the Schutz. What does Strozzi do to make this dramatic? How is she bringing the singer into the action? What is she doing to dramatize the text? So here's Lagrime Mie. Okay, so we'll skip ahead to the aria in just a sec, but let's talk about that recit for a bit. What about that felt dramatic to you?
I was gonna say, well, first of all, it starts off with like a bunch of sforzandos and stuff. Like, she's like, she does a lot of like dynamic contrast in this as like a soloist. I would say, like, you might hear like that kind of like dynamics in a choir, but like you don't hear a lot of people going really, really soft in as a soloist. Like,
Wait, before you go on, perfect. Does anyone remember what those little hairpins are called when you start soft, get big, and then boom?
are you asking like what the musical term is for it?
Yeah, what is that Baroque musical term that we use?
Isn't it like sforzando or something?
Yeah, today we would call it a sforzando. They called it that exclamation, that exclamazione. So we talked about that a couple times ago. That was a specific Baroque vocal technique that you grow and then you back off again. Boom. Okay, good. Sorry, Nathan, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say like, um, actually, I kind of lost my train of thought. It was basically, also the pausing. That's what it was. I was gonna say something about the pausing. Kind of like felt like she was almost saying like, okay, I'm singing this phrase. Now I pause, think about what I said, process what I just said. Okay, now I'll keep going.
It really is a go sit in the corner and think about what you've done kind of moment, right?
Yeah.
Precisely, good. And that would all be part of ancient Greek rhetoric. Putting pauses in your speech was a strategy that Aristotle would have advocated. If you were going according to Aristotle's recommended structures, then he's going to recommend you put pauses in at certain points. So good, this is all part of that Baroque looking back to ancient Greek rhetoric. Good, what else does Strozzi do that makes this so dramatic?
I would say the use of chromaticism, like rising chromaticism.
This is total seconda pratica dissonance, right? This is the kind of thing that Artusi was rebelling against. This is the kind of thing that Artusi thought was going to destroy civilization. And yet Strozzi, like Monteverdi, is using dissonance to make the text come alive. Let the text be mistress of the music. Good. How about those melismas? Can we talk about the melismas for a second? Anybody notice anything about those?
They were kind of decorated with like the throat articulations.
There we go. There's that ribattuta di gola, right? So it's almost like the singer's like continually hitting rapid fire. But even the melismas, when she's putting several notes on the same syllable, do you guys notice that written out in your score? Yes. No, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Some of those
Sorry,
basic
my
ones.
mic was not coming on.
It's all good. All good. So some of those basic melismas are written out, but notice how much the singer has to add too. Notice that it would be expected for a soloist to embellish in, I don't want to say stock gestures, that diminishes what they're doing, but embellish in strategic ways around the cadences. So Strozzi is giving her melismas to work with, and the singer then has to like spice it up a little. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Well, it is 10:45, y'all. And hey, we timed it really well today. So we finally hit the end of our discussion right on time. Any questions before y'all continue with your lovely days? Okay, then in that case, I will see you Wednesday. Have a happy rest of the Monday. And good, excellent. And stay safe and happy till then. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Marissa, y'all good? Marissa? Marissa?
Yes, sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to stay. I thought I left.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure we're all good.
Yep.